Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to our combined Sunday school classes, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro on this, the sixth Sunday after Epiphany, Sunday, February 14th. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I'm so glad you're able to join us again as we gather together virtually to worship and study. Our Sunday school teacher, Sandie Gravett, will be joining us shortly as she continues her brand new series, Dreaming Big, Constructing Hope, lessons from Isaiah chapter 40 through 55. But first, let's sing a hymn together. For almost a year now, we've been gathering together, virtually if you will. So today I thought we should sing that hymn, We Gather Together to Ask the Lord's Blessing. Now, this is a hymn that we usually sing in and around Thanksgiving in November, but it really wasn't written for the Thanksgiving season at all. It was actually originating from all the religious strife occurring in the 16th century in Europe. It was written in 1596 by Adrianus Valerius. Now that sounds like the name of a great poet, doesn't it? Well, he was actually a great poet in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands had been in war for such a long period of time, he couldn't make a living as a poet. He was actually a toll and a tax collector of all things. But he did write a series of poems to celebrate the Dutch victory over the Spanish forces at the Battle of Turnhout. Now, the Dutch had been fighting a war of national liberation against the Catholic King Philip II of Spain. Under his rule, the Protestants of the Netherlands were not allowed to worship together. The poem, the hymn, if you will, was sort of a in-your-face statement back to that Catholic ruler, saying, "By goodness, yes, we will gather together." It was translated as a prayer of thanksgiving around the late 1800s, and so that became its association with the Thanksgiving season, and it was brought to the Americas in the early 1900s by the Dutch Reformed Church. It's sort of a strange parallel, but the COVID pandemic has kept us from worshiping together in person, especially since last March. But thanks to computer technology, we too can sort of say, oh yes, we will gather together virtually, and we're so fortunate that we're able to do that. I'll put the words to this hymn up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me. We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing.
We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. He chastens and hastens His will to make known. The wicked oppressing now cease from distressing. Sing praises to His name. He forgets not His own. Beside us to guide us, our God with us joining, ordaining, maintaining His kingdom divine. So from the beginning, the fight we were winning, Thou, Lord, wast at our side, all glory be Thine. We all do extol Thee, Thou leader triumphant, and pray that Thou still our defender wilt be. Let Thy congregation escape tribulation. Thy name be ever praised, O Lord, make us free.
Today, in our study of Isaiah 40 to 55, we are going to be in the same chapter where we were last week, chapter 40. We will hear at the outset some well-known words, echoed hundreds of years later in all four Gospels, to describe John the Baptist's arrival on the scene. Check out verse 3. A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." And by the end of this chapter, we find this familiar refrain in verse 31. "But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." In other words, our passage today expresses ideas that have been central to the Christian message and served as inspiration for generations of Christians. But to get at what the prophet is doing in this chapter and to take away some new lessons, we can't just stay on the surface of the text. We have to first talk about the relationship between political status and theology. We have to look closely at how the prophet shows us the necessity of being receptive to new theological ideas that speak to the circumstances in which we find ourselves, both personally and corporately. And then we have to wrestle with it all as we sit on the cusp of the seasons of Epiphany and Lent, having seen the manifestation of who God is in the world and anticipating the struggle and the suffering that is yet to come. Let's start with the relationship of political status and theology. That linking might not be as obvious to us as contemporary Americans as it was to the people of Israel in the time of this prophetic work. After all, we live in a world where the United States is a superpower. The economic, military, and diplomatic sway that our country exercises around the globe not only gives us as a people a sense of security in the world, but it also means that, at least until COVID, we have often taken for granted the ability to travel and to conduct business around the globe, many times in our native language and using our own currency. We think of our way of life as something to export to other countries. We see our country as a beacon to people who want more for themselves, knowing that this same desire drew many of our ancestors to settle here. And many times we think about God, however a non-national concept as God might be, as bestowing on us special blessing and being on our side when it comes to the struggles we encounter as a nation. All of this is quite distinct from the situation of the people of Israel when the prophet spoke the words we are encountering today. Of course, their central theological presupposition might sound similar. They were taught to think of themselves as unique in the eyes of the God they worshipped. Indeed, their story had a vast sweep to it. The dominant imagination of the relationship with God that was at the core of the people's identity was the Exodus and the subsequent encounter with God at Sinai. It was a story of deliverance from bondage and being made into a people via a covenant with God. But there was more. From the wilderness wandering after Sinai, the tradition recounted how God brought the people into the land and they grew into a nation. Although they were a relatively small group, they had eked their way through hundreds of years with their capital city and the home of their God in Jerusalem. It was no accident that the temple sat right beside the palace, something we will talk about more in the weeks to come. But while they had never really seen themselves as on top of the political heap, they still were struggling with what had happened politically in their region. They were still trying to figure out all that it had taken from them. Let's begin to think that part of it through. The audience for these words was living firmly in an age of empires. For as long back as the people could remember, there had been the Assyrians and then the Babylonians asserting control over the region. As I mentioned last week, however, Jerusalem still stood. But now, a generation just previous to the one the prophet addresses had watched the removal of their king, the destruction of their capital and their temple, and had experienced the exile and the scattering of the nation. And we know from the advantage of history that this procession of empires was not going to end anytime soon. After the Persians, there would be the Greeks and then the Romans. Now, all of these actions shook the people politically for sure, but it also disrupted them theologically. Their understanding of who God was and where God resided was undercut. They were asking the same question that philosopher Emil Fackenheim asked after the Holocaust. How can we go on thinking in the same way after what has happened? The simple response was they couldn't. But the question became, could they adapt what they knew to new circumstances? The prophet here is trying to do just that. This passage begins by asserting a familiar image from the story of the people, being in the wilderness. We need to go back to the book of Exodus, where in chapter 3, Moses is described as being on the backside of the wilderness when he came into God's presence at the burning bush. In chapter 14, when the newly escaped people are chased by the Egyptians to the edge of the Red Sea, they turn to Moses and say, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?" After they successfully escaped the Egyptians there, we hear in chapter 16, the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And when they come to Sinai, look at the description at the beginning of chapter 19. On the third new moon after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They entered that wilderness and they camped there. And of course we know that they will wander in the wilderness for a very long time, Bible speak being 40 years, following the forging of the covenant at Sinai. Thus, when the prophet here starts out, a voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord." That prophet is situating the people in a place that should be familiar to them. God did not first encounter their ancestors in a temple. In fact, the prophet is going to push the idea that this God does not operate like that at all. This God, their God, is where this God has always been. This God, their God, is where they are, and that is in the wilderness. It is untamed territory. It is unpredictable. There are all kinds of challenges to survive. And that is their primary obstacle right now. The first verb up here is pana. We are accustomed to saying prepare, but the primary meaning of this verb is turn. In fact, the word face derives from this verbal root. The prophet is asking them to turn to or to direct their attention and effort towards the way of the Lord. That is how you get to the idea of turning. Make straight in the wilderness a highway, a public road to our God. Notice that I did not go with the traditional translation, a highway for our God. That's because I don't want us to think that what this prophet is calling folks to do is working just so that God can traverse towards us. Rather, I want us to see that what the people are called to do is to construct a road so that anyone, anywhere, can move toward God. Look at how that work is described. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low, and uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. When I read this passage, I think of my time living in Boone. My house was about a mile off of Highway 421 as it is coming into town. Now, when I first moved up there, you were coming up the mountain from Wilkes County, and you went from 4 lanes to 2. And you had to traverse through windy up and down terrain for miles. And there were very few places to pass that truck that inevitably was in front of you. While I lived there, and thank goodness it did open before I moved, they constructed the 4-lane road that exists now. It took years. It required heavy equipment and technical expertise. They had to blast through mountains, add fill where there would have been steep drops, and figure out how best to handle the stretches that could often be icy or foggy depending on the season. But as you can see, they made a fairly level road, so that access to town was significantly improved, and the drive was, I can assure you, far more inviting. Let me be clear. A similar task is what the people in exile had to do. They had to keep working their way through complications and difficulties to build a road toward God. But unlike the process of building a road, it is not a task that you ever fully complete. In other words, every people in every place who want to be in relationship to this God have to figure out from wherever they are. We have to figure out from where we are how to build that road and to work through the obstacles. And the reason for that, why would we engage in that effort? The prophet tells us clearly. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. It is really an amazing statement. Our task is to live in a way to make apparent to people anywhere the glory of the Lord. What once existed in Jerusalem at the temple will now be available more broadly. But what they were being asked to resolve, what they had to come to terms with, was that the temple was always only a symbol of the divine presence. It was not the seat of a wilderness God whose glory could not ever be confined. Now, this stance does not undercut the importance or the value of the temple, or the efforts that were going to happen to rebuild it, the priority that was going to be set on that. But there was a fundamental shift happening here. The temple would never again be the sole venue for thinking about who God was and what God was doing in relationship to the people. And given the advantage of knowing the history and how it unfolded, the advantage that we have, I think we can say they were fortunate to do that work of making the shift at this juncture. Because while a second temple is going to be constructed, and while it's going to become grand and glorious and powerful again, the people were also at this time developing a text, the Torah, and they were developing places to study that locally, synagogues. And they found ways in that process to be the people of God, no matter how proximate to any temple they might be. That work meant that they were ready and able to survive when the Romans destroyed the second temple in 70 CE. But that's another story, and I am digressing. Let's get back on track. The challenge before the prophet at the time when these words were penned was not an easy one. People not only had to know the challenge, they had to be motivated to achieve it. Here are a couple of indicators of that struggle. A voice says, "Cry out," and I said, "What shall I cry?" All the people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades. When the breath of the Lord blows upon it, surely the people are grass. The indication here is that people may not quite be as resilient as we would want them to be. Here's another. "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God. We find out in these verses that people have given up and given in. Many were left struggling to understand how their idea about God had failed them. They didn't know where to go from that point. That's not to be unexpected. Challenging times will always mean that some fall by the wayside. The prophet, therefore, must try and pull folks back in, not simply by reorienting them to a new view of the deity, but also by getting them excited about that view and willing to commit to it. Moreover, given that people are scattered all over the region, that view couldn't be about a local God or a territorially bound God. And one last thing, given that they would not be able to reestablish the nation, this view couldn't be about a God tied to a single political entity or undergirding the power of a particular king or emperor. Thus, offering a new view of God is an enormous task. So when we read chapter 40, what are some of the things we should notice? First, I would say there are clear prophetic directives in this chapter. We have already heard the call to comfort last week and to cry out this week, but here is yet another. Upon a high mountain get up, you, the one bringing good tidings to Zion. Lift up with strength your voice, you, the one bringing good tidings to Jerusalem. Lift it up, do not be afraid. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. What I like about this call is its sense of urgency and the idea that all this news is good. While the text can be read largely as a call about promoting the restoration of the city of Jerusalem, it is also designed to rev up battered and beleaguered people, and maybe even a few disinterested folks, to take a chance on thinking about God again, the God of their ancestors. And in that process, they are asked to do a second thing. They are to ponder the power and the might of this God. Now, this power is described both in traditional terms. Behold, the Lord God with might comes, and God's arm rules for God. It's that great, strong right arm of God. But more significantly, there are also given terms that had not been so prominent in the tradition. In this period, we're going to start to see a real focus placed on God's role as the Creator. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of the hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, and closed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Or you might look at something like verse 22. It is God who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them like a tent to live in. Or verse 28, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. It's not that the people of Israel had not previously told stories of God as creator, but that role for God had never been the central one. Once the people had to exist in a more international context, however, their God has to be more than the God of a given locality, of a given nation. There had to be a universal scope to this deity's power, or else the whole enterprise was lost. And there is here specific attention to something else. We are not talking about this God in terms of idols or other representations. To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with God? An idol? An artisan casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and casts for it silver chains. As a gift one chooses mulberry wood, wood that will not rot, then seeks out a skilled artisan to set up an image that will not topple. The people of Israel, you see, are living in communities where many different traditions with various deities are competing for their attention. And their representations of their versions of the divine can be eye-catching and in many regards alluring to people who appreciate having something tangible to help them think through the difficult questions of how things came to be as they are, what it all means, to guide them through painful moments. When the people of Israel then had to think about how to build their lives and get along, one of their obvious questions was this: what does it mean to put one's trust in a God that is less obviously visible than other gods in their immediate environment? And to the present circumstances, to put your trust in a God not associated with a viable nation. Thus, the prophet had to remind them that rulers are only temporary, as are nations. All the nations are as nothing before God. They are accounted by God as less than nothing and emptiness. Or, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing? Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when God blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. It might be a difficult thing to hear when the Persians are controlling your life, but it's a reminder that in the waxing and waning of history, there are going to be rulers and nations coming and going. But even more significantly, the prophet wanted to say, God is the one ultimately in control of all the powers that move lives. To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and see. Who created these? The one who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them by name, because God is great in strength, mighty in power. Not one is missing. It is ultimately a challenging imagination of God. You are trying to get people to believe that their God is more powerful than any empire. You are trying to convince people to take a harder road, siding with a God who promotes ideas that offer a system of values and a way of living that is important and distinctive, but not obvious. That's where we get this second verse. Whom did God consult for God's enlightenment? And who taught God the path of justice? Who taught God knowledge and showed God the way of understanding? It's a way of saying that there's nothing on this earth that counters the way of life that God is promoting. Thus you get some of the most astounding pictures of God as a God who is, in the end, on your side, taking care of and supporting you. God will feed God's flock like a shepherd. God will gather the lambs in God's arms and carry them in God's bosom and gently lead the mother's sheep. Or one of my personal favorites, the God of evermore is the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth. God does not faint or grow weary. For God's, and here the word is understanding, discernment, intelligence, is unsearchable, giving to the faint power, and to the ones without vigor God multiplies might and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall down exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. These images of God are a call to recognize that as we are engaged and invested in the work which God directs us to in our wildernesses, whether those wildernesses be personal, like the loss of a job or a home or a loved one, or whether they be corporate, struggling with the fate of a nation, a life that is changed, the toll of a pandemic, we will grow weary in our efforts. It's a stark acknowledgement. This work, then, will challenge the best of us. It will exhaust us, even the ones who seem most prepared to handle all of it. But the prophet is reminding us that we are not alone, that we are not without resources, that we are not without support. It's the perfect reminder as we move from the joyous celebrations of Christmas and Epiphany, of saying, God's here, we see the Lord, and we turn our hearts toward Lent. As we move with Jesus in the days ahead on his journey, we understand the trials that are ahead, and we will begin the process of pondering yet again the very same question that is being put to these people. They're being asked how their struggles are revelatory of the glory of God. We're going to have to figure out how the cross reveals God's glory. It's a subject that takes a lifetime of investment to think through. I hope that you're ready to take that journey. Thank you for your time this week. I look forward to picking up another text in this series next week.